Hi, I'm Anne-Marie Segal, and welcome to Discover and Communicate Your Unique Value. We are recording this webinar, and we'll send it around probably tomorrow, taking off the bit we just did at the beginning, hopefully. We will not be checking the chat box during the webinar. It is a webinar, so it's not interactive in that way, but we will leave a lot of time for questions. We anticipate people will have questions. Tasha, who's on screen now, will be monitoring the chat box and sending questions to us, or probably just posing them directly on behalf of people and trying to aggregate questions. So hopefully your individual question will be answered, but go ahead and leave it in the chat box during the recording, during the webinar. And there's also a handout in the resources section that I wanted to call your attention to. And I call your attention to it, but I urge you to not start to look at it right away. We'll talk about it a little further on. So with that, I'd like to introduce Dave, whom I've known since 2016. When I first met Dave, I have to admit, I did not understand a lot of what he said in our first call. I do remember him saying, I don't want to be known as a rocket scientist anymore, which is the first and last time I've ever heard anyone say that sentence. And so Dave, he trained as a physicist and engineer. A lot of the folks here are probably science PhDs, but they may be other PhDs or just general audience, and it's open to anyone. But we're talking today about the particulars of a multi-dimensional person like Dave. He designed sensors for space satellites at Sandia National Labs. When I met him in 2016, he was a senior researcher at the RAND Corporation, and he told me I have 11 things in orbit, which makes me realize why people kept calling him a rocket scientist. He was solving large-scale problems at organizations like, or for organizations, sorry, through RAND, like NASA and DARPA, FEMA, and the DoD. He also was and continues to be part-time a professor working with doctoral candidates at the Party RAND Graduate School, which is the original and largest PhD public policy graduate program in the United States. When we connected, it was really important that Dave started to think about how his intersectionality is really about design and visual storytelling and how that was going to come out, and some other parts of his personal value proposition. That's what we worked on together when we first met. And it's become, and it was at that time, it's become even more an integral part of his narrative and what he does with his own clients at Imaginative Futures, which we'll get into a bit more further on. So with that, I introduce you, Dave, one of the smartest people I know. I know you hate that, but it's still true.
My inner Midwesterner wants to find all of the people who are okay. Anyway, thank you. That is very kind. I will just say thank you.
Yes.
I'm still Dave Baiocchi. I want to acknowledge my colleagues Danny, who's on the phone, and Galen and Katya, who helped out with today. And I also want to acknowledge my friend Joyce, who is a similar P in this pod. We, I think, both have struggled with this. And so she helped identify some additional people who are probably here because of Joyce that maybe will struggle with the same thing. So if you're here because of Joyce, thank you, Joyce. And thank you for being here.
Joyce, you were green. Where'd you go? Oh, she's gone. Okay, there you are. Hi, Joyce. Thanks.
I'm going to introduce Anne-Marie really quickly. I will get into my story maybe a little bit more, but I was really struggling in my mid-30s on like who I am, how do I describe myself? And I started looking for someone to help. And, you know, in Southern California, there's a lot of 19 and 20-year-old career coaches. And I knew from the start that like that just wasn't going to work. And so what drew me to Anne-Marie instantly was when you look at her bio, you see that there's a number of career pivots that she's had. And I'm like, okay, this person understands. She has fought the good fight. So she started off with a master's in art history, and became a practicing attorney after getting a JD in 2000. And she did that for 15 years. And she was at in-house law firms and private equity. And, oh boy. Then in 2015, she decided to make her own pivot to an executive coach and writer. And so that's when I met her. I was looking for someone to help me figure out what my story was and tell it. And one of the first things I learned in working with her is the power of getting like a third party to come in and listen to you and say, here's what I think you're saying. And then your modesty doesn't get in your way, your ego doesn't get in the way. You've got some other human that's providing an assessment. And so that's one of the first things she taught me. And we have remained, I was a client for a long time, and now we're friends and colleagues. And we maybe should at some point tell why we're doing this today, but maybe at the end. So I am super excited that we have a chance to work together today and share some of your knowledge that has helped me so much, with hopefully others who it would help as well.
Thank you. Thank you. And Tasha, we had you wave your hand, introduced you for a moment. Also Paul and Rachel, Teresa, a couple others on my team. I'm not sure if you're all here, Leah. So thanks. Thank you for being here and supporting us. And anyone reach out if you're interested in getting to know them more. So Dave, I want to start with this question. You did your own PVP, being personal value proposition. Why? What did you discover, and why was it so important to you?
Well, I started where most people probably start, which is to start with like a job requisition, or somebody's like, send me your resume. And so you start on the weekend and you're like, oh my gosh. So you start with like the functional stuff. What did I work? What did I do? And what I realized over time is I was just like banging my head against the wall, just doing these like bite-sized like deliverables for job reviews. And when we started working together, you explained this concept to me, and I quickly got that if I could figure out this personal value proposition, which we will explain to everybody what it is in a moment, it becomes the foundation upon which everything is easily built. So I think of it as either the compass or the foundation of who I am. What do I care about? What do I love doing? What are people going to ask me to do in the future? It's a bunch of homework that you do ahead of time. So then when it comes time to create a resume that matches to a job, it is so much easier because you've answered the hard questions of who am I and what do I want to do? I think that's a short answer to the question.
Yeah. Yeah. And when we were doing the prep, you were talking about interviews and elevator pitch. I mean, it makes everything easier, honestly.
Yep. Once you've got this thing figured out, online presence, website, CV, cover letters, job search, anything related to finding your next, like a conversation with your neighbor about what you want to be doing. It all feeds from this. And so that's why I've attached to it over the years so much. And now I teach my own students this thing.
Great. Well, so building on that, what about the folks today in the webinar? What do you want them to take away?
Okay, so the reason we're doing this today is, I've been just I've had a little bit more time lately to sort of reach out to my network and just get to know people again. And one of the things that I have observed is that I think there's a lot of people who are struggling with this. And I know that you have a solution to this. And so that's kind of how all this started, is like, let's just do this, invite some of our friends, and hopefully they can avoid some of the speed bumps that got me all hung up. But specifically, if I would consider it success if everybody leaves today with three things, right? Like the first is to realize like, this is not a rare problem. Like all of us struggle with this, especially if you have multiple interests. And so I just want to do a public service and say, like, you're not alone. The second thing is I'm hoping you can teach us sort of the basics of the tool. And I know that you've written 100 pages of detail and nuance, but the basic concept is really simple and elegant. I think that's why it works so well. So I'm hoping we can go over that. And then the final piece is maybe giving people a little bit of advice on what they can do to actually get started. My inner engineer, one thing I really liked about this is it's it is like sort of workbook based, right? Like, okay, well, this is the part you want to figure out. Like, here's some questions that you can start reflecting on or asking your friends about. And I really like that about it, that I just wasn't like stuck in a room with a blank piece of paper and my own thoughts.
Right. I call it navel gazing sometimes, that doesn't really work. um, we
Okay,
can make
so
it better through navel gazing, but we can't figure out what we want to do with our lives that way.
that's right. Okay,
Right.
well, I feel like we've held everyone in suspense too long
Yeah,
here. Can you give us the quick overview of what this thing is and how it works?
sure. Sure. Yeah. Do you want to pop up the chart that you guys put
Yeah.
together?
Take a look. Those of you who know me know I'm a visual person. And so I told Anne Marie, I was like, oh, we have to have a juicy visual for this. So we made one. And this is what's in
Yeah.
the handout, the resource.
Yeah. So I love it. And on the left side, you see the PVP at the bottom with the squares, and then it builds up. This is what you were talking about before, about how it's the base of everything. So the PVP, you see, it's the intersection of priorities, strengths, and market needs. Priorities and strengths, when we think about these, this is your side of, I don't want to say your side of the equation. I don't sound like a mathematician when I say it that way, but these are your two parts that add up to the PVP. Market needs, obviously, to some degree, is more out of your hands, but not completely. And I'll talk about that in a minute. Strengths is something that we're more used to talking about. Our strengths and our weaknesses. It's something that, even if you have your inner Midwesterner and you don't like to brag about yourself, you might be more familiar with your strengths. Some of them you may not be, like leadership, for example, is a strength that a lot of folks, especially scientists, but PhDs, they're so used to having to be subject matter experts, and they don't think about the other strengths outside of that. So when we think about strengths, it's not just the substantive skills, it's also the soft skills, and it's also your talents, just the things that you're normally good at. So maybe you're entrepreneurial or maybe something else, and we can talk about that more. Priorities is really like when you're thinking, oh my gosh, so what is it that I want? What is it that I want out of my job? What is it that I'm interested in? Where do I find meaning? How can my work environment fit my preferences? I mean, COVID has made us think about this a bit more in terms of remote working, but it's much broader than that. And then these two areas, the strengths and the priorities, you kind of matched against the market needs, which it's defined here, or it's explained here as market needs refer to existing or potential future roles. The higher you get up in your career, the less fungible you are, the less junior you are, the more you differentiate yourself. There is more and more opportunity to create a role for yourself. And so that's the potential future role that could be created. So these three pieces add up to your PVP.
So when you were designing this, why these three pieces? Why aren't there four? Why aren't there two or a dozen?
Someone mentioned to me recently, Ikigai, I think it's called, where there's another, I just learned about it a few weeks ago, but it's actually some of the same similar elements, and it's 4 pieces. So it could be that it's not just these 3. What I focus on with these 3 is this: what you're interested in and what you're good at pretty much determines where you're going to be successful, where you're going to be motivated. The other model I was just talking about has this idea of purpose, which I think a lot of us aren't really that familiar with. At least this is a Japanese concept, at least in the Western culture. We're not as familiar with thinking about our purpose. It's kind of a complicated thing. Priorities includes that in this model. Your priorities are what gets you out of bed in the morning, what you'll fight for, that sort of thing. Your strengths are where people are going to want to recommend you, connect you with jobs, etc. So those two pieces work together really well with the market needs. And frankly, and market needs doesn't necessarily have to mean a paid job. It could mean your vocation. It's where you're going to have impact. But if you think of these three pieces, that's it. It's very simple. They add up to create where you're going to find this match, right? Where there's a fit, and that's your PVP. Does that explain it, or more questions?
I love it. And the fact that it's a Venn diagram means that you can love playing the guitar, but if you're no good at it, you're not going to be a rock star. And you can love typewriter repair, but if nobody's willing to, or you can be really good at typewriter repair, but if nobody's willing to pay for it, that doesn't do you much good either. So I think thinking about it like a Venn diagram is smart.
Right, right. And so that we were talking about that in the prep session as well. You could be good at lab work, but it's no longer your priority. I was mentioning Brian May from Queen, PhD. You could be loving singing, playing guitar, being in a band, but we're not all Brian May. And so we're not all going to be rock stars, or at least maybe that's something in your future, but maybe not a strength yet. Maybe you've got to actually learn some chords first. So strengths, actually, Tasha was asking me this morning, what about a future strength? And I said, well, I think of that as an interest, so that's actually a nice little way to think about that. And then, right, the market need. If you do something like, what did we say also? Star Wars cosplay, something that in addition to typewriter repair, Maytag man kind of thing. If there's no market need, or there's not enough demand, then you're going to be trying to fit yourself into a really small space, and you're not going to have abundance. Part of this is to be thinking about empowering yourself, taking charge of your career, and not feeling that you're working from a place of scarcity. So thinking broader about your strengths and your priorities and where that could fit with the market will make you be able to feel that way, like there's an abundance in your career. So can you take this down? Because I like seeing you directly. Thanks. Dave, I want to ask you a question. Why is it so hard for people with advanced degrees to figure out their PVP, especially if they're multidimensional?
I spent a lot of time thinking about this. I have a few thoughts. The first is that, assuming that we're talking about people who go to college, but even if we're talking about trade school or other education paths, you're going to be in a program that's likely going to train you by discipline, right? So like I got a BS in physics. And so I was surrounded by physicists who were taught by physicists. And so when I left, I knew how to talk and think like a physicist. And I used to say, I knew how to say like, well, here's all the things we can do. Right. And that's really great. Like if you're going to stay in physics, I think a lot of people do that, right? But I've personally always had a lot of interests, and maybe by then I had discovered that maybe there wasn't a lot of market need in the physics part. So like what happens if you're into physics and art? That's harder for a few reasons. First is there aren't as many of those people, right? So like, what does somebody like that do? I wouldn't even, back then I was like, I don't, what does that job look like? I have no idea. There's nobody I could ask. And I don't know how to describe themselves. I don't know what they're going to be hired to do. And there's also a sense of like fear and uncertainty and lack of safety when you start thinking about this, right? Because it's like, well, nobody else, looks like this or has this sort of background or is portraying themselves in this way. And my default reaction used to be, oh, I must be doing it wrong. But now when I start feeling that fear, that's a sign I'm doing it right. Because the whole goal here is to figure out what sets me apart from the million other people that have a degree in physics in this world. And it turns
Mhm.
out that it's all these extra little intersections. And
Right.
something you mentioned a few minutes ago was that we need to take a broader look at our skills. And, you know, when I graduated college, if you asked me what I was good at, I was like, well, let's see, I guess I can TA a lab and I know how to set up an experiment and I'm okay at writing up the scientific method. But it wouldn't even occur to me to tell you about all my hobbies or the fact that like I'm okay in front of a crowd, you know, that kind of stuff. And
Mhm.
it's all that extra stuff that adds up to make your unique value proposition. And when you're either telling somebody about what you want to do in an elevator or you're trying to write it down in a cover letter, like that's the story where somebody's going to be, oh, this is different. They're not just a physicist. Um, yeah.
Right. And then you can be more refined than I'm a physicist who likes art. You know, you can
Yeah.
think more about how those pieces work together. Because one of the things I always tell my clients is it's your job to connect the dots for people, not just to give them the dots and expect them to
Yeah.
connect them for you.
Yeah, that's
So
really
a
good.
lot of process, you know?
Yep. I had an old mentor who used to say, like, your story is really easy to tell in retrospect, right? Like you can go
Hmm.
back and look at your little dots and say, oh, I can come up with something that connects that
Right.
together. It's not easy looking forward, but take advantage of that, right? So like, okay, that's what you helped me do, right? I think my question when I came to you was, okay, I got this degree in science. I went to go work in a lab and now I'm at a think tank. Like, how does any of this make sense? Um,
Right.
that was the work together.
Well, and now I'm in a think tank and I may or may not want to stay there, but I want to stay there intentionally or leave intentionally. Like I want to be more intentional about my choices. That's what I remember you saying.
Yeah. Okay, so I've told you a little bit about the where people run into challenges or why people have a hard time describing this. You do this for a living. What
Mhm.
additional barriers do you see people fighting, or I don't know, even common mistakes or paths they start going down that
Yeah,
are not productive?
yeah, yeah. Um, so anyone who's um, highly intellectual, it doesn't mean you have to have an advanced degree. You could be a high school grad, but anyone who's very brainy is going to think they should know how to do something already. I mean, that's a casualty of being smart, right? And so I'm sure everyone on this call can relate to that. You feel like you should know how to do it. Your inner critic comes out. Well, you know, it shouldn't be that hard. And because it's so hard, there must be something wrong with me, is the way we usually think about it. Um, but we're not taught how to do this. It it's not something that's taught in school. It's even something that's discouraged. At least I know it was in law school, and when I was at the University of Chicago getting the master's and considering the PhD route, knowing a bunch of PhDs, it certainly wasn't encouraged there. And I don't think that either of my institutions are unique, NYU and U Chicago. Um, School is taught to, you're taught to be a good student. You're taught to, do the things that students need to do. You're not necessarily taught what that means when you come out, or how to apply what you learned in the subject matter expertise, as we were talking about, to everything after that. So then you're stuck in this situation where you're like, well, I have this high priced education, maybe overpriced education, and I can't figure out now what to do with it. So this is supposed to fill that gap. That's where the PvP makes sense. And to help cure a bit of overwhelm, because especially in our modern world that we're recognizing more of the mental health issues, it you, it's not just the navel gazing problem. It's the sitting in a room by yourself saying, I want to beat my head against the wall. Why can't I figure this out? So another thing I want to cure with this webinar. It's not just that it's not taught, but it's hard to teach. I mean, that's why even though I have the book, we're doing this, trying to take a little slice and go through it. And And it's not something that can be forced either. It's something that you need to take the time to do, which is another thing that many high achieving folks don't necessarily want to do. It's a form of self-care, but it's also a form of long-term thinking about your career. A lot of my clients have the issue that they're like, I'm going to just put my head in and do the work. And they don't look up and think about what's next and what's next. And so that's another piece. It's another reason that this is hard for folks.
Yeah. I'll add one of the reasons it's counterintuitively hard is like, who knows me better than me? Why can't I write about me?
Right, right. And the answer to that is because you're so stuck in your thing, your problems, your shit, if you will. You know, you're just so stuck in it, and you have to take a step back. And so to have a tool like this where you can, and we'll talk about more like maybe sharing it with others, but even in your own sense, you can be more objective, writing things down, crossing them out, even, you know, replacing. But it's not just all going on in your head. It's getting it outside of yourself. You can walk away from it. You can put it up on the wall. Your handout's beautiful. Like, suggest people do that, you know, but also the, not just the first page, but the other pages, you know, to really take a step back and take a look at it. Here are my strengths. Here are my priorities. In fact, when I used to work with clients more in person, we would take the really big Post-it notes, you know, and just put them up on the wall, and you could do one of each page. You just rewrite the title and the market needs as the third, and just put them up and really be thinking about them, and write down everything that you can. When you think about your own strengths, what's everything that's ever been a strength of mine? And then you can go back and rank them, for example. So, yeah.
Love it.
So I think we keep up a question for you to ask me, but I can just do it, which is the idea of discover your unique value, right? Discover and communicate, the first part being discover. So we talked about this as a research project, right? Do you want to go through the 4 pieces?
So we were, as Anne-Marie and I were kind of preparing for this, we want to provide people with like easy on-ramps,
Yeah.
easy ways to think about this. And it occurred to us that I know there's a lot of researchers on the phone or researchers at heart. You can think about this as a research project, but about yourself, right? And just based on some of the names that I've seen on the attendees list, like, I know you all know how to do research projects, right? So starting with like, well, what's the problem we're trying to solve here? What's the question? It's like, okay, well, we need to figure out these 3 pieces and then how they fit together to make a story. And so then the next piece on research is like, gather some data. And one thing that struck me when I first started this is that it doesn't all have to come from here. One of the easiest ways to solve this problem is to don't answer these questions yourself. Go ask your colleagues, go ask the people who know you the best. One thing I do with my students at the beginning of every year is I send them all out and I say, I want you to talk to your best friend and your partner or whatever, and tell them what your personal and professional superpowers are. And you have to write down exactly what they say. There's no filtering, and come back and tell us. And then as a class, we'll sort of listen and see if there's themes on what each person's being told. So again, if navel gazing is a mental block for you, as it was for me, a really easy way to start is to not answer these questions yourself. It's to call a parent and ask them. And
Can I
try to, sure.
Because I think the no filter concept is really important. Because I'm sure there are people who come back to your class and they say, I don't know why I don't see this in myself. I don't know why people said this. Is this one of my strengths? And then people in the class will go, oh yeah, right?
I had that experience early on. I don't remember exactly what it was, but I got some feedback on a strength. And I was like, it's really important to resist the urge to be like, really?
Yeah.
So write it all down exactly as you hear it. And then And then, and our little research analogy here, like analyzing all the data, right?
Yeah.
What themes do you see? Maybe getting a friend to help you analyze the data and again, insert some objectivity into that. And then the final piece is like, well, what are the insights that resulted from all of this analysis? What are the things that are starting to emerge, simply put, in the middle of that little red section, you know, the intersections of the Venn diagram. So if it's helpful to think about conducting a research project on yourself, you should take that approach.
So we have defined the problem, gathered the data, analyzed the data, come to tentative conclusions, and then either conclude or repeat. Is that right?
Yep. And maybe share your conclusions with the people who gave you the data and see if they're like, that's about right.
Yeah, yeah. So I haven't been really looking at the chat, but I know someone said, can Dave share his PVP? So I'll let that stew with you for a minute. But in the meantime, I also wanted to ask you, well, first, talk about this concept of creating a market and ask you how you did that with Imaginative Futures, with using the PVP model or in general, but thinking about that idea of market needs in terms of a role that's not yet created. Can you speak to that a bit?
Yes. So the short answer to the PVP question, which is directly related to this, is that Anne-Marie wrote me a sentence in 2016 that I'm still using. And the gist of it is he works in science, technology, and the human experience. I think it's what we did. And the fact is, you know, when I was thinking about leaving Rand, I was thinking about starting my own business, and it was going to be a services consulting situation. And the fact is when you do something like that by yourself, at least initially, it's just you and you are the business. So the business is often your value proposition. So in this case, having that in my back pocket was a really great starting point. By the time I left Rand, I realized that I had this like weird, unique thing of like knowing technology, knowing research, and knowing design and art. And you can do a lot of really interesting things when you can combine all three of those. And so that was the starting hypothesis for the business. Like, okay, well, this made me unique and I was hired within Rand's internal labor market. This is just going to be a business, but the world is the market and not just the other research preparation. So,
and I love that you were able to bring these together, right? Because people don't necessarily, I mean, it's like chocolate and peanut butter or something, right? I mean, you use the visuals to communicate to four-star generals, to communicate to, you know, CEOs, to, you know, in the health equity space, you know, like all over. What you're doing is you're saying, I'm taking this problem that everybody thinks is intractable or complicated, and it is, but I'm finding a way to express it that you're not just reading, you're reacting to it at a more basic level in the visual space. And so once, see, and that's what you're talking about in retrospect, because once you did it, it's like, oh, wow, of course, that's so obvious, you know, why doesn't everybody think of that? But it was rough going until you were able to systematize it, right? And really say, okay, so this is the system in which I'm working. Yeah.
There's another reason that makes this hard, and that's that the things that we are best at are the things that we have the hardest time realizing we're best at, because we're so good at it, it just comes naturally, right?
Yes.
Like somebody will say something and I'm like, oh, that's a diagram, bah, 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 bah. And for years, I'm like, oh, that's not a skill. Like, that's just something that happens. But I don't have the context to know that, like, that is actually the unique thing. So it's this weird irony that often the things that we're best at are the things we're most blind to about what our talents really are.
Right. And that's why, again, it's helpful to go out, not just to the folks that you mentioned, but others who might have good feedback about you. I sometimes call that a personal board of advisors.
That's good.
Which is just a fancy way of saying getting a bunch of people together who know you well and care about you and have differentiated ways of helping you figure out all this stuff, professional stuff, that where you want to go, how you want to get there, how fast to push, not, or whatever, all those decisions that you need to make. So for example, when I was at the last law firm I was at, when I was there, someone said to me, "You are so good at networking. You brought in all these people, and I didn't really even think of it as a skill, like you're saying, it's just kind of like, oh yeah, well, doesn't everybody like join a firm and within the first year bring in 2 new employees, and et cetera, et cetera. Like I hadn't really focused on it. But then once you focus on it, you can be much more empowered, because then, inner Midwesterner side, and I am also from Illinois. My mother went to the same college you did, DePaul. Even with the inner Midwesterner, and we were joking about this, but this idea that you don't want to blow your own horn, you don't want to sell yourself. But once you have your strengths really identified, it's a service. It's a service to the people that you're working with as clients, or a service to the world, or both. Often both, if you're doing it right. And then it's the fact that you have that clarity means that you're not busy getting in your own way all the time.
Yeah. And I'm sure a lot of people can relate, but like, there's nothing worse than somebody who's like, who asks you like, what do you do? And you're like, can I do this? Can I do that? Like, it's so much better just to have a crisp answer. And to your point, like once you've got that compass in place, everything that comes in, you can compare it against the compass. And it's like, all right, is that going to help me? Is this opportunity going to help me with my strengths and my priorities? Yes, great, let's do it. And if not, like, waste of time. Wait for the next one.
Right. Well, and just to go back, when you were saying why these 3 pieces, priorities is the thing that we often discount. We feel like, well, I can't have priorities. I just need to get a job. Or I can't have priorities because I need to work for 10 years, or I need to finish this postdoc, or I need to be this many years past the postdoc, or, whatever. But priorities are really what drives everything, and helps you figure out a place that you're actually going to be successful. It helps you make decisions. So the PVP, when you do that list of priorities and lists of strengths and everything, you shouldn't just, okay, now I've got my intersectionality of these things, I'm done. You can pull it out when you're considering a job and say, okay, does this line up with what I said 6 months ago, or 6 days ago, or whatever, that are my interests, my values, my preferences, which are the 3 types of priorities that I identified. The preference is that I don't want to commute this many miles away, or the preference is that I don't want to be solo, I want to be in an office with people, or the preference is that I want to be leading a team, not just part of a team, or vice versa. I'm not feeling like I want to lead yet, but I want to have some opportunities maybe to be able to get there. I mean, whatever those things are, if you just take whatever job's offered to you, that's what you're going to get. But if you can identify and really know yourself, I mean, that's okay. I always told you I was going to pull up the book at some point. I'll just do it. That's the beginning of the book. Know yourself. And that's intentional, because if you don't know yourself, you're not driving the train. You're just getting driven. Or flying the rocket. Talking about you. Sorry. Yes.
It was our intention, the 2 of us, to just give a little background and teach the tool really quick. And then we wanted to have more of a Q&A discussion. So I would propose maybe we transition to that. Okay.
And Tasha, do you have any questions to key up for us? I want to know how much time. I see 2. Are there just 2? Because if there are, we can, and I think we might have answered one. So then we do have more time to think about teaching the tool.
There are just 2. If people could put in their questions now, that would be great.
Okay. Tasha, do you want to read off the question and show us your cool rocket? We were admiring it earlier today.
Okay, Here's my.
So,
My Lego rocket.
yep.
I think that, are you going to talk about using the tool and maybe give an example, a concrete example of a PVP so that people can get an idea of what it would look like?
Mm-hmm. Sure. Let's dispose of this question. Well, I don't mean dispose, but let's answer this question first, so that we make sure that we've answered it for the person who asked it, because it's here from 7:20 and they've been probably thinking about it for 23 minutes now. So do you want to read it off to us, Tasha?
Sure. What if I think my strength is that I'm very good at administrative skills and I might be a great secretary. However, I want to be an executive and not the executive assistant. How do I think about being an executive?
Well, Dave, do you want me to take this one? Okay. So the first thing I would say is the way it's worded is my strength, as if there's one strength. So I know that the most productive executives are actually really good at a lot of these things. So I wouldn't worry about the fact that you're good at them and think that that's an impediment to becoming an executive. I would actually think that that is going to enable you to be a better executive. And the other thing is, because what I said at the beginning, that it's my strength, as if it's a singular or a singular category, think beyond that. Think about, so this is where the market needs really comes into place. So I hadn't wanted to get too deep into this, but like a job description, for example, or a set of job descriptions that relate to executive roles could help you mine for the type of strengths that you might need for that role. And then you can match that up against yourself and say, okay, so here or any other data point that I get through my diligence, my research project on the market needs, where are my strengths and how do they compare? And then again, also executive roles, that's a group, that's a category, but that's not monolithic either. There are a whole lot of different types of roles. And, to that point, I have a friend who I told I was giving this webinar, and she's a history PhD. She said, oh, is this just for science PhDs? She's also already now done. She's like, Dave, she's already gone out and made her career, but I wish I'd had this 20 years ago idea. And she went into credit, and she went into risk, and she does risk management, risk analysis. And she said, honestly, the fact that I have this history PhD is why I can understand the story of the company, because that's what I did as a history major. I figured out what's the narrative here? What's the thread that goes through all of this? That's what you do when you get a history PhD or even a bachelor's in history. And so she said, there was one company I couldn't understand. Nobody where I am could understand it until I started getting all these pieces and I started putting them together and saying, okay, so how does this all make sense? And then I cracked the code. And she said, I couldn't have done that without having gone through this history PhD. So that's another example of how sometimes your transferable skills aren't really obvious until you get to use them. And that's why it's good to experiment and not just sit in your room and try to think about it.
So I would humbly suggest, this is to our anonymous question asker. It sounds like this is a good opportunity to not answer this question yourself, but to start with those around you and see what they say.
Yeah. So Dave, what was your thought? I want to be conscious of time, and I see a couple more questions came up, but what was your thought about actually teaching the PVP?
Here's what I'd propose on Hallie's question about a concrete example. You have that 1-2 page in the book where you have a notional person, maybe based on a real person, but a notional person, where you have the description and you bring it all together. that is going to be a much more complete and helpful illustrative example than the Dave Baiocchi version. And so to answer that question and maybe have everybody feel like this is a little bit more tangible, I would propose we pull those 2 pages out, if you're willing, and share them with people.
Sure, absolutely. And I can put them in, I think Tasha has a lobby open for a year, so we can drop this page in after the webinar and people can look at it as well. But the idea of this is that Alex is a mid-level marketing professional. So I'll try to read through this quickly without just sounding like I'm reading to everybody. But, you know, his interests are, he's got a quirky storytelling style. He likes to work directly with clients. He wants to move into a management role, travel internationally. He loves nature and animals. And so maybe could bring that in the same way that you could bring in your love of music or something. So that's kind of the bucket of interests. Values and preferences. I mean, I wrote in here, his values are to make a difference in people's lives and not just sell products. That's something he's really committed to. And he also has a nephew on the autism spectrum. So that's an example of something. And so, sorry, that's not the value, but he's finding ways to increase employment opportunities for people on the spectrum is his value. That's something that you may or may not be able to work into your job for the entire time that you are working, but it is something that you could be thinking about in terms of, is that a possibility? Could I bring it in? Could I bring it in into my work directly as my main part of my work? Could I bring it in as a pro bono or side project? Could I work up to it? Could I work around it somehow? Could I just do it in my job, like at my company, be supportive of this? So that's another example of how something could seem very unrelated, but it's actually not necessarily. And then the preferences include, he likes to work autonomously, but he likes to have a team to bounce ideas off each other, quiet work environments where people are serious about their work. This is a really getting to know yourself idea. And it goes on. And then the skills and talents, and then the market needs. You evaluate your current firm and the strengths and weaknesses. Think about how you can make your job better there using the PVP, and then think about other agencies. If he has the resources, temperament, and desire to start his own firm, and that's that entrepreneurial base, you know, that's another thing to think about, especially your risk tolerance. I mean, that's the biggest thing. You talked about fear before, Dave, and I meant to say this before. If you're, you know, like they talk about the difference between sensation and pain. Like if you've got a really strong sensation, but it's not actually pain. I think of fear the same way. Like if your fear is just adrenaline and it's pushing you and it's exciting, that's great. And then if your fear is like, ugh, you know, then that's not great. And so the entrepreneurship journey, I mean, I don't know how it was for you, but often it's like people need a kick in the pants to get out there. And then they're like, oh, okay, I didn't like fall. I don't need that safety net. Like I can ride this bike, or whatever analogy you want. So there's that.
Okay, well,
How's that? How's
I
that?
think it's good.
Yeah.
And I think sharing that paragraph for people to see how all that sort of comes together, super helpful. All right, I'm gonna call that one answered. All right, Danny has a question, which is a good question. She asks, if we want to expand the common area of the Venn diagram, where would you recommend investing your time? Revisiting your priorities, expanding your strengths, or spending more time studying and understanding the market? An excellent question.
So I'm a lawyer, so I always answer it depends. Once a lawyer, always a lawyer, but it's true. I think I would start with saying, where do you think that you need the most help? Where have you been negligent, if you will? Sorry, that is a legal term. I didn't mean to do that. Oh God, can't get away from it. Where have you been repressing, avoiding, whatever, not taking a look at yourself. For example, if you've just been working and working and working and saying, I'll care about myself or my own priorities once I've established my career, then that's probably a time to look at your priorities, and then look at your market needs after that, maybe, and then come back to your priorities and say, okay, so how can I make these two fit together? If you're very clear on who you are and what you want, and you've taken a step back and realized that it's not just that you feel like you're in control, because that's not the same thing, right? As being very clear on who you are and what you want, then maybe it's time to go out and look at market needs. I also suggest that people do that. A lot of folks, they stay at the same place and they forget to opportunistically just look around, see what's there, see what's available to them. Even if they stay, it will make it so that they are able to contribute more and get more out of where they are. So it's not an exercise in trying to leave. It's an exercise in trying to make yourself more marketable so that you are more confident, so that you can do a better job, so that you can realistically say, is this place somewhere that I want to continue to be? And how can I continue to add value? Not just so that they get, the profits or their kudos or whatever, but so that I can continue to grow my career. So I don't think there's just one answer to that, but I do appreciate the question. The expand your strengths, I would say if you're unhappy in your own career, or you have that interest we were talking about before that you really want to develop, then maybe it's time to expand your strengths. So it's very specific to the individual and the timing of where they are in their career and their life.
I don't want to put my finger on the scale too much, but I know this individual, and I don't think you have to expand your strengths. You're pretty well covered there.
Okay, so for that person, the other two.
Excellent advice. Okay, next question. Oh, wait.
Yes.
Tasha, you had your hand up. Was I imagining that?
Oh, sorry, I did not mean to have my hand up.
Okay.
Okay, next question. How do personality traits play into this, like work ethic? So where would you put that one? In what category?
I would probably put that, well, I would probably put it in preferences. That's my thought first. And that's because, well, I guess it depends on what you're trying to get out of the information that you have a strong work ethic. Are you saying that you want to be somewhat like what I read off, that he wants to be at a more serious workplace? Some people don't. Some people like the foosball table and all of that. And some people like doors closed, quiet, so they can think. So what does work ethic mean to you? Why is that coming up for you? And if it's a preference because you want to be valued for your work ethic and you want to be in an environment that's a priority, then clearly it's a priority. If it's a strength, what I would say about work ethic is a strength, I guess this is worth saying, is it's a strength if you're a junior person and your only contribution is that you're a Duracell bunny. I always say Duracell bunny. I don't know why, but work ethic is table stakes. Like the jobs we're talking about here, if you don't have work ethic, go home. Why are you here? I don't think of work. I don't mean to disparage the person who made the comment. I'm sure that person had a very strong work ethic and they might have a stronger work ethic than others. But I would say probe deeper, because I don't think work ethic is really the right description if you're talking about a strength. Maybe it's leadership, maybe it's emotional intelligence, maybe it's something else. Yes.
I would even hypothesize another way you could frame this is yeah, I work hard, but I tackle the problem until it is solved, right? I don't leave loose ends. That's a slightly more refined way of if that's the aspect of work ethic we're talking about.
Right.
I mean, to your point, whether it's a preference or a strength, what aspect of work ethic are you looking to highlight? That's the key question. I think that leads to the next
Right.
one.
And that's also why it's helpful to get outside information, outside insights and views, because data points, that's what I was looking for. Because sometimes they'll use a word that you just haven't been able to articulate about yourself, for example. Say, oh, that's it. In coaching, we call it naming it. You know, that's it. That's what I was looking for. It's not work ethic. It's something beyond work ethic, for example.
Yep.
2 more minutes. I don't think we have any more questions. Do you want to tell us anything else? We were going to get into a bit about imaginative futures, Dave. How did you define?
What's that?
How did you define your market? Or how did you get? How did you get going? Like, tell us something about what the PVP did for you in that space.
It helped me identify the type of client that I was looking for. And when you're first starting out, you don't get clients by putting your name on the phone book. You do it by talking to people. And so having that information in the back of my head of like, okay, I'm looking for like thoughtful people who are looking for a bespoke solution, who enjoy the journey. That was very helpful because you can very quickly, after meeting a potential person you might be working with, to assess and like, okay, I think they're in the zone. Like, I think they're going to get what I'm putting down. Okay, I want to recognize there's another question, and we are here for our participants and not ourselves. So I'm going to read this one off. Are there priority strengths, market needs? Okay, let me start over. Are priority strengths, market needs equally weighted? Is it helpful to weight different parts differently based on the stage of your career? Like focus on learning in the early part of your career and maybe focus on market needs later. I guess another way to reframe this, an additional question would be, in your experience, how do people with 30 years of experience approach the PVP process than somebody who's fresh out of school?
Wow, again, it depends. I'm sorry to say that, but it does. When I wrote the book, I thought it would be mostly helpful to junior and mid-level people, and my executive clients use it all the time because they sometimes have gotten so far away from thinking about grounding themselves that they need to do it again. And the KISS formula, keep it simple, stupid, is really why it works. So is it better for a junior person or senior person? I mean, I think it's equally applicable. The thing I would say is that the further along you are in your career, unless you're looking for a career pivot, you're probably more attuned to market needs. But again, this is why it depends, because sometimes people take a whole new look at their career. They may know their strengths in a certain context and not in others. As far as learning, focusing on learning in the early career and focusing on market needs later, I would counter that a lot of the learning you should be doing is about the market needs in most jobs. Like when I say market, I don't just mean like financial markets. What I mean is what is the landscape, or Dave, you used the word ecosystem at one point when we were talking about this. What's the ecosystem that you're working in? I mean, that's a lot of what you need. That's not school learning. That's not book learning. That's not lab learning. That's like if you're in the lab, even in that space, and you're understanding what are all the internal dynamics going on here? How do we get funding? How do we decide what we want to research? Who's going to lead it? What space we're going to use and how we're going to maintain it. Like all of those things are learning, but they're learning about market needs because they're learning about what are all the pieces that fit together to create a job. And what would my day look like in each of these different roles? And so that understanding is critical at the beginning of your career.
Okay, I have a follow-up question for you. A few minutes ago, you observed to the person who wanted more of an executive role, okay, well, why don't you look at job postings that advertise for an executive and see what skills are, like, that's a tangible activity they can do in 30 minutes.
Yep.
Can you give us 2 or 3 quick activities that our gang here can do to get a better sense of market need, or to assess market need, to learn about the market?
Yeah, I'll put that page up in the book as well. There's a couple of activities that you can do, but informational interviewing is one that I would definitely recommend. That is a term of art, essentially means to interview to get information, not to get a job. It could lead to a job, but you don't bait and switch and say, oh, I'd like to talk to you, Dave, about what you do. And then, by the way, can you give me a job? You know, because if Dave, you want to give me a job, then you will, based on the informational interview. Or if you want to recommend me to someone else, et cetera. And I'm cognizant that it's at least my time 8:04 and yours 5:04. So we'll wrap up really soon for those who are wondering how long they want to stay on. But I'll just want to answer this question. So that's one thing. Informational interviewing really, if you ask the right questions of people, if you get curious about what they do and what you can learn from them, then that's a really great tool to understand market needs. And again, be going to a diverse group of people. Be going to your first degree connections and asking them who else you can speak to. And then from there, moving on and out. And that's something I would suggest people do all along their career. That's not just for junior people. Dave, you could even do it, you know.
This is a counterintuitive thought, but if you call somebody up or if you send them an email and say, hey, your job looks fascinating, would you tell me about it for 30 minutes? Very few people are going to say no to that. It's a non-threatening question. You're asking somebody to talk about themselves. Like, it's not that scary as it might seem. And that's one thing I've learned.
You're hitting on a really good point, which is we often think, what do I have to offer this person? Why will they want to talk to me? And it is true that if you approach it from what, you know, I and others in this field call transactional, from a transactional approach, like, Dave, I want to get information from you so that I can use it, so that I can get a job, and then I'm never going to call you again, and I'm going to forget your name and lose your phone number. You know, that's one thing. But if I'm actually genuinely interested in, you know, Dave, I want to be in your field someday. Maybe I even want to be you someday. And so what you're offering then in return is like a genuine interest, not just pumping for information that you can go and leverage later, but a genuine interest in this person and what they do. Then yes, absolutely. And that's how you can dispel the fear, because you are offering something in return. I mean, that's why you're doing this free webinar, right? Is for people who, I mean, I'm not saying everybody's going to get 30 minutes with you. They're not. Not everybody on the webinar or the replay is going to get 30 minutes with you. You're never going to do anything else. But that's why you decided to do this, was because you wanted to offer your time to folks, you know? So absolutely. And we should probably wrap up here. So Tasha, and thank you. Everyone on Dave's team at Imaginative Futures, thank you. Everyone at Segal Coaching, and all of the attendees, thank you so much. We'll endeavor to get the recording out soon, and have a good afternoon and evening. Bye.